Hi and welcome to your introduction to the E3 paper. As you can see here, we've started off with a short description of what the paper involves, and as you'll immediately notice, it logically follows on from E1 and E2. So with E1 and E2, what we learnt about was how organisations, for example, could structure themselves, how they could manage their key strategic resource, their people, how they could manage processes efficiently through project management and building relationships both inside the business and outside the business. And all of that is going to be pretty much assumed knowledge by the time you get to E3. So when we get to E3, we are going to come across some syllabus theories that you've seen before, but we're going to be looking at them at a much higher level and in a completely different context. So at E3, it's all about taking all that operational stuff that you've learned previously and thinking about how we as an organisation can use that to develop strategies that allow us over the longer term to generate sustainable success. So in other words, how are we going to generate strategies that are going to help us be more profitable this year as well as next year and into the future? And you're definitely going to feel, hopefully, that we're moving away from operational management to strategic management. So in other words, we're going to be advising people on how to manage the changes required and how to lead to the change that is required. So now we're going to think about not, for example, how you run a project, but how you run an organisation. So how you lead from the front, how you set the example required, so that all of the grand strategic plans that you come up with are effectively going to percolate down through the organisation. Now this is reflected somewhat by the syllabus that we're going to have a quick look at below here. So we've got an E3 syllabus and we've got the weighting of the topics. And the weighting is significant only insofar as this will help us consider how each topic is going to be examined in the new multiple choice exam structure. So we've got our first syllabus topic here, how an organisation is going to interact with its environment. And here we're going to see some of the topics that you would have seen before in earlier papers. So for example, of course, we know that an organisation can interact with its environment by scanning it using things like pest analysis. Or for example, we might do some competitive analysis, or we might take a look at Porter's 5 forces, or you might use Porter's diamond to try and identify what opportunities and threats exist within the wider environment around an organisation. But what we're going to see at E3 is there's much more of an emphasis on what we can do with those outcomes rather than how we generate those outcomes. So rather than thinking, how can I scan an environment? Oh, that's right, I'll use a pest model. What we're now going to think about is, well, I have scanned the environment, so I've done the pest, and what I've discovered about my environment, for example, is that perhaps it's highly uncertain. So now we're going to consider, well, what can we do in terms of planning a strategy in an uncertain environment? So now we're going to start to consider the importance and the good and both negative aspects of advanced techniques such as real options analysis or scenario planning or other forms of foresight. So that'll be the major aspect of dealing with the environment, other than considering how the environment represents perhaps that source of opportunities and threats that's going to influence the types of strategies that we create. So having thought about how we're going to deal with our environment and specifically how we're going to combat uncertainty in that environment, the next thing of course we're going to have some consideration of is the organisation's current strategic capability, and we'll do that by looking at its current strategic position. And here again we're going to lean quite heavily on some of the theories that you've seen before. So for example, hopefully you remember that one way in which an organisation can generate a strategy is to look at its current strengths and weaknesses. And once you've identified the current strengths, we've identified, for example, the critical success factors that underpin what the company is good at, we can then think about generating strategic options that play to those particular strengths. And a theory that's going to be of significant importance here is, of course, Porter's value chain. So we're going to think about how we can enhance what we do that's already good, or how we can overcome some of those strategic weaknesses by perhaps enhancing the value chain by using IT, or alternatively thinking about how we can get those linkages more clearly defined and structured within the organisation. And following on from models such as the value chain, perhaps we'll take a wider organisational view by looking at the organisation's total portfolio of products, services and subsidiaries, etc. So we'll have a look at how the Boston Group consulting matrix will help us do this. Now, of course, any organisation should be capable of identifying lots of opportunities, lots of threats, and thinking about how it can exploit those opportunities and how it can combat those threats. And if we do this properly, we should end up in a position where we can theoretically identify numerous strategic options. And one of the key skills that you're going to require at the highest level of the organisation is the ability to disseminate what is a good and valuable strategic option, whereas perhaps other options are less valuable. And we're going to come across a very clear structure for doing this. So you're going to look at Johnson, Scholes and Whittingham's suitability, acceptability and feasibility framework. So you'll be able to determine, for example, whether or not something is a good idea. In other words, is it suitable? So does it play to the organisation's strengths? Does it, for example, allow us to move towards an opportunity? And we'll be able to frame this within the context of specific theories that we pick up. So, for example, we can take a look at Porter's generic strategies. So does it play to our differentiation strengths? Does it allow us to pursue cost leadership? We'll then think about whether or not something is acceptable. And acceptability, as we'll see, is going to be linked through to the idea of stakeholders. And stakeholders is a pretty significant topic within section A of the syllabus there. So when we're interacting with the organisation's environment, we're not only thinking about how it's going to impact upon our employees, we're also going to think about whether or not something is acceptable to our shareholders, perhaps to our customers, and perhaps to the government and the regulatory bodies. So acceptability is going to encompass not only the financial rewards, but also whether or not this project, this product, or this service that perhaps we're aiming to launch will actually meet the market needs. And then finally, something that's really largely a function of common sense is the idea of whether or not a strategy is feasible. In other words, can we do it? So do we have the financial capability, the technological capability? Do we have the legal permissions? Do we have the skills amongst our staff, etc.? Successful change management then will always be the key to whether or not an organisation is able to effectively implement successful strategies. And this is really reflected in the real business world. So for example, think of any large organisation and think about why it's successful. Well, typically that is a combination of its products and services, but also the strategic leadership of that organisation. I think Apple's a really good example of this because the technologies that Apple produces is typically very quickly and very easily copied by its competitors. So think about the iPod, think about the iPhone. When they first come out, they're class leading, but very, very quickly other people like Samsung, for example, are able to bring through products that are perhaps technologically superior, perhaps they're easier to use, and of course typically they're a lot cheaper. But Apple has, over a very long period of time, been able to maintain a very strong market presence. And that's allowed it to underpin extremely high prices, allowing it to make very high margins. And a lot of this was down to the way in which Apple is led. So of course it had its very famous leader, Steve Jobs, who ferociously drove the company forward, but they've suffered difficulties since Steve Jobs unfortunately died through their new CEO, Tim Cook. And he's currently coming under quite a lot of pressure in 2014 to try and maintain the very strong growth that Apple had demonstrated over the previous 15 years. So of course, he, the new chief executive, is trying to introduce changes subtly to allow Apple to meet the new challenges that it faces, and whether or not they will come through that sticky period in the years 2013, 14 and heading into 15 will really be down to the quality and the strength of the leadership that the CEO and his executive team are able to demonstrate. And what we'll take a look at in E3 are perhaps some of the major ways in which an organisation should think about overcoming resistance to change, planning for change, managing change, right from the grand what's our new strategy level to how are we going to implement this, how are we going to percolate this down through the organisational levels. Now, change management and leading change is of course a major aspect of implementing new strategy. But when we think about implementing strategy from the perspective of E3, what we're really looking at here is performance evaluation and performance management. And this is a topic that integrates and leads quite nicely into P3. So in the ICS case study that you're going to go on to study shortly, you'll see there will hopefully be some fairly obvious crossovers between the performance management aspects of this paper, where we start to look at techniques that hopefully you're already familiar with, such as return on investment and residual income, etc., and how that ties in with the aspects of performance management in your risk paper, but also in your financial strategy paper. Now, aside from the purely financial aspects, a really big part of the E3 syllabus will be the balanced scorecard. So thinking about how an organisation is going to implement strategies and gain control over those strategies by measuring the outcomes on a much broader range of metrics. So looking beyond just the financial returns, but also thinking about how successful we are at interacting with our customer base, at managing our internal operations efficiently, and then crucially in the modern business environment, being able to innovate quickly and effectively. Finally, we'll take a look in the syllabus at the importance of information systems. And it's really important to understand here that the focus in the E3 syllabus and in the E3 exam will be on information and how information can be harnessed through effective systems rather than the technology itself. So you'll start off by thinking and defining what information is and what an information system is and what different types of system an organization can use. Then we'll take a look at how information systems are built. So how do we define the informational needs of the company? How do we translate that into hardware and software requirements? Then on a much bigger level, we'll think about the importance of things like knowledge management. So for example, by understanding my market, my competitors, my products, and so on and so forth, if I can harness information and data in those areas, I can then make much smarter business decisions. And hopefully it'll allow me to be much more successful in my interactions with the market. And this will be reflected by the sections in the syllabus where we start to look at how we can deploy IT strategically in areas such as marketing, and in doing that we'll probably have to exploit powerful IT tools, for example like databases, that will allow us to pursue big data analytics, which is one of the emerging trends in business, something that's being deployed in a whole range of commercial sectors. The objective test exam then is how the syllabus is going to be tested, and in common with all of the ICS papers, so E3, F3 and P3, the pass mark is set at 70%, so you have to have a high degree of accuracy and you can't therefore afford to leave any section of the syllabus untouched. You've got to be pretty proficient in all areas. So it's a computer-based exam. You're going to get 90 minutes in which time you have to answer 60 questions. So time pressure will be an issue for some students if you like a lot of time to read the questions and to think and ruminate on some of those questions. And you have to bear in mind some of the questions will come with fairly lengthy scenarios. So you've got the opportunity obviously to work through the materials that BPP are providing, and we've aimed across things like the achievement ladder to try and replicate the length and complexity of the real CIMA questions. So there will be occasions where you need to set aside a couple of moments to read through and to digest all of that scenario information. As we've mentioned, the syllabus weightings will be reflected in the exam. So if one part of the syllabus is worth 30%, well, of course, you can expect around about 18 or so questions on that particular topic. And those questions will take the form of either multiple choice, so which of the following four is correct, multiple response, where you'll be told perhaps two of the options are correct, and you have to get both of them right to get any credit. So if you got one of the two correct, you wouldn't get half marks, you're still going to score 0. Sometimes you have to drag and drop things around to perhaps match up a theory with the correct description. Sometimes you'll be given gaps to fill, so a little bit of data entry. Could be given a diagram of a well-known piece of theory at E3 and asked to drop the corresponding correct part of the theory into the right area. So for example, I could envisage a question where you're given Bowman's strategy clock and you're given some descriptions of the various types of theories, so like for example a no-frills theory, and you have to drag that into the correct part of the blank theory template. And then finally, sometimes you'll be given a drop-down list. So against a number of options, you have to drop down and select the appropriate option from that list. Now, each of the exams is available on demand, so you'll have to contact your local BPP centre through their customer services team to arrange when you want to sit the exam, and the moment you press submit at the end of the paper, you'll be pretty instantaneously given your result, whether it be hopefully good news or whether or not you're going to have another attempt. So to conclude then, we're just going to wrap up what we think you need to do to pass your objective test exam. And bear in mind that BPP trains literally tens of thousands of students per year to go through objective test exams across a range of syllabi. And of course we've been doing this at CIMA for papers C1 through to C5 for a number of years now. Now, from our experience, and certainly from my experience as a tutor, I think the achievement ladder will certainly be the key to success. So working through the steps in the achievement ladder will expose you not only to the right number of questions by the time you get onto the later stages, but those questions will mimic the depth, the complexity, and the style of the real exam. And because this is going to be an exam that requires a lot of knowledge and a degree of application, the only way you're going to be certain that you're reaching competencies in those two areas is by constantly assessing and testing yourself. And that's what the achievements ladder will allow you to do. Now at E3, the examiners are looking for a reasonable degree of application, so it won't be a case of what does this theory stand for, it'll be a case of here's a problem, how can you use that theory in order to answer that particular problem that they're suffering from. So you'll need to be able to put topics and concepts into a commercial focus and therefore into some kind of context. And again, the only way you're going to do that is by practicing questions. Merely reading over the notes and familiarising yourself with the theory isn't going to help you identify, for example, which is the most appropriate approach advocated by a theory to take in a given set of circumstances. So change management would be a classic example of this in E3. So for example, Balogun Hope Haley will talk about evolutionary change, revolutionary change, Big Bang, incremental changes, but only by reading through questions and thinking in these circumstances, what is the speed of change required, what is the scope of change required, will you be able to effectively deploy that theory and use the knowledge that you have. So to make sure that you work through all of the stages of the achievement ladder in a logical, sensible order within a sensible amount of time, you should of course refer to the study plan. And I would say the most important thing that you do is to make sure you attempt the exam quickly. Of course, it's very easy to put off the exam if there isn't a set date, and you might never feel like you've done enough preparation or you never feel that you've done enough work. But I think it's really important, not only just because you want to get the lifetime pass assurance qualification, but mainly because you want to pass the paper first time round, to try and attempt your CBA exam within 3 weeks of the end of your study period. The longer you leave it, I think the more of a temptation there is to put things off, and of course slowly your mind will start to fill up with real world stuff like work and home, and less about E3 and all of the kind of technical components required to pass your exam. So I would certainly recommend working your way through the achievement ladder, but most importantly making sure you get into that CBA within a relatively short period of time at the end of your studies.